Let's continue exploring the universe within art and the art within Redstone. I'm your host, OmLedu, and this is a continuation of my Let's Learn Redstone series. This video was requested by Wayward Bard on my Discord, so thank you so much for getting on there and talking to me and requesting a video. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at everything about the Sculk sensor and the calibrated Sculk sensor. We'll start off with the basics and then work our way up to examples that I'll show at the end of the video of how you could actually use these. But never fear, they really are not as complicated as they may seem. There's just a lot of subtle nuances to think about when going to design a machine using these. And a big shout out to Sweet Sugar. Thank you so much for leaving a comment on one of my videos. You are totally awesome. But without further ado, let's jump into it. So the Sculk sensor and the calibrated Sculk sensor both detect vibrations from various actions that occur in the game, such as jumping around, moving around, placing blocks, eating food, using items, etc. etc. Now they are basically the same, except the calibrated Sculk sensor has this little input right here, this little purple section, whereas the regular sensor doesn't. Now this little input is for a redstone signal strength that will dictate a specific action that it's looking for. So like this one right here will ignore us jumping, it'll ignore us eating food, it'll ignore items being used, because it's looking for just us walking around. So when we walk around near it, it will trigger, but it will ignore everything else. And we'll talk more about how to determine what it's looking for later on. Another difference between the regular Sculk sensor and the calibrated one is the distance at which it can hear. So the regular one can hear up to 8 blocks away, whereas the calibrated one can hear up to 16 blocks away. And this includes vertical distance as well, above and below the sensor. So essentially, anytime an action is taken within the radius of the sensor, it will activate. So anytime that we or another entity move around or interact with things within the radius, it will activate. Now there is one exception to this, and that is wool. You can move around, jump around, or run around on top of wool, and it will not hear the vibrations. You can also place wool, and it won't be able to hear that you placed the wool. Wool is basically silent. And the calibrated Sculk sensor works exactly the same, except that the radius is a lot bigger. And as you may or may not know from your time exploring ancient cities, but not only is wool silent, but it also blocks vibrations that are trying to get to the sensor. So if you place wool on one side of the sensor, it will not be able to hear the vibrations from that side. And the range of the soundproofing is basically a diagonal line from the wool block if it's placed orthogonally to the sensor. So like here, none of the blue blocks will activate any sort of vibrations, but the red blocks will. So as soon as you step on one of the red blocks or interact with something on top of the red blocks, the sensor will notice it. Now, this also allows you to build a tube out of wool so that the sensor can only notice the block that is directly above it. And the way you get a redstone signal from a sensor that is surrounded by wool is by simply using a comparator. The comparator can see the sensor through a block just like it can see containers through blocks. And this allows for really simple secret activations. As soon as you walk onto this block, it will activate the sensor. And because of the wool tube, it will not activate from anywhere except for the block directly above it. And of course, this can be any block, so you can have it be the same blocks as the floor, so no one can tell that it's even there. But as soon as you place something on top of, or walk on top of, or anything on top of that single block, it will activate. But no matter what you do anywhere else, it won't be able to hear the vibrations, so it won't activate. Now sensors do make a little noise every time they're activated, which can be kind of annoying when you're trying to make them secret. But if you flood them with a bucket of water, they will be silent whenever they activate. They will still activate as normal, but they will just not make a noise. And then you can use a comparator to pull a signal out from a solid block that's blocking in the water, just like you can with wool. But of course, for the comparator to actually see it, it needs to be looking straight through the block at the sensor. Now the signal strength of the redstone output from a sensor depends on how close to the sensor the action is taken. So if you're really close to the sensor, it will have a maximum level of output, but if you're really far away, it will have a very low signal strength. Now this is actually super duper helpful for dictating how far away you need to take an action in order for the sensor to activate. But if you don't care about distance, sometimes you will need to use a repeater in order to guarantee that it activates whether you're close or far. But if you use a comparator that's looking at this sensor, it doesn't care about distance anymore. now no matter how close or far away you are, it will have the same signal strength. And that is because it's actually showing you the signal strength of the action that is being picked up, not the distance. And so in this case, jumping is a signal strength of 2, shooting a rocket is a signal strength of 3, and so no matter where we shoot a rocket, it will always have an output of 3 if there is a comparator looking at the sensor. But if we don't have a comparator looking at the sensor, it cares about range. So the closer that the rocket is, the larger the output, and the farther away that the rocket is, the smaller the signal strength of the output will be. And you will need to know the signal strength of specific actions if you want to use the calibrated Sculk sensor. And so this is a list that you can find online. I got this one off the wiki that has all 15 categories of actions listed by the signal strength of the redstone. So like a signal strength of 15 is mobs or players dying or an explosion. So you'll need to reference this if you're planning on using the calibrated Sculk sensor, or if you want to use a regular Sculk sensor that will ignore certain actions. So like here, we have a regular Sculk sensor that will only give an output if you do the correct action. The sensor itself will always activate regardless of the action, but the redstone circuit will only allow for the correct action to be registered. So in this case, we have it to where it only activates if you use an item such as shooting a rocket. And I will explain how this circuit works later on in the video, but there's other things that we need to talk about first. So this book and lectern are simply providing a specific signal strength. And with this design, it needs to be one less signal strength than the desired action. And it doesn't need to be a book and lectern, which we will talk about here in a little bit, but the book and lectern is just the easiest one to change the signal strength that it's providing. So if we turn it down to 1, that means it will be looking for an action that on that list has a signal strength of 2. Because again, with this design, the book is set to 1 less than the action that you're trying to find. So in this case, it will ignore us placing blocks or using items, anything that isn't an action level of 2. But then for this design, it is basically the same, except we have an extra piece of dust separating the comparator from the sensor, and now this one senses distance. It doesn't care what action you're taking, it cares about where you're taking that action. And so now we will only get an output if we do something on top of that red block. If we do anything anywhere else, it will not actually get an output because of the circuit, but if we stand on this red block and we jump, or we move around on this red block or we shoot a rocket, we will get an output. So in this design, the book and lectern aren't controlling the type of action, but the distance from the sensor in which the action is taken. And again, I'll talk more about how this actually works here in a little bit. I just needed to show what you can do with these sensors. But as for the calibrated Sculk sensor, it is a little easier to understand. So basically, the signal strength that is going into that little purple side will dictate what action it's looking for. So if we set this to 3, it will look for actions that have a signal strength of 3, such as using a rocket. And it will ignore everything else. So like placing blocks or jumping around or moving around, it's only looking for things that have a signal strength of 3. So basically, a calibrated Sculk sensor does the exact same thing as this first design that we looked at. The main difference is that a regular Sculk sensor will activate even if you're not doing the correct action. It is the redstone circuit that's actually blocking specific actions. And so you could have multiple outputs from a regular sensor. But also the regular sensor's book input will need to be a signal strength of 1 less than the action you're looking for because it's being subtracted from that comparator. Whereas with the calibrated, it's looking for a specific action. So if it's set to 3, it will only activate with actions that have a redstone strength of 3, such as shooting a rocket. And now again, I know this is probably confusing, but I will explain it better as we go along. I just needed to show exactly what these things can do so that we can go from there and understand why. And like I mentioned before, it doesn't have to be a book and lectern. It can be any redstone signal. It just depends on the strength of the signal. So if we put a lever right next to it, it has a signal strength of 15, which means mobs and players dying or an explosion is what this calibrated is looking for. So it will only activate when mobs or players die or an explosion happens. So you could have a lever that is run far away from the calibrated Sculk sensor, and remember, it just depends on the signal strength that's going into the Sculk sensor. And so you could even use, like a container with a comparator on it. As the container fills up, the comparator's signal strength will increase. And so if you're looking for a signal strength of 7, you can have a barrel full of this many swords. And so how you get the signal strength that you're looking for is totally up to you, whether you use containers or whether you just run the redstone farther away. You can fill up a container until it has a signal strength of 13 and then place down your calibrated Sculk sensor, and now it has a signal strength of 13 going into it. Just a book and a lectern is really cheap to make, and if the book has 30 pages, then every time you turn the page, it will increase the signal strength by 1, if the book has 30 pages. So if we turn the page 1 time, so now we're on page 3 and 4, it will have a signal strength of 2. Or if we turn the page 4 times, it'll have a signal strength of 5. Or if we turn the page, 14 times, all the way to page 30, then it will have the maximum signal strength of 15. So whenever I make a 30-page book, I go through and I like to write the number of the corresponding signal strength. So on page 1 and 2, that's 1. On 3 and 4, that's 2. Basically every time you turn the page, you just increase the number by 1. And so that's why we use books and lecterns, is because they're cheap and they're easy to customize. So again, if we have a calibrated Sculk sensor that has a signal strength of 3 going in the input, then it's looking for us using an item. And then, like we mentioned before, if it doesn't have a comparator coming out of the sensor, it cares about distance. So the farther away you go, the weaker the signal output will be. But if we go and we put a comparator coming off of the sensor, now it just cares about the action. And so no matter where we shoot the rocket, it will always have an output of 3, because that's the action that we're taking. And so if you want to know the signal strength of a specific action without looking it up online, you can just place the comparator down next to a sensor and then do the action that you're trying to filter for, and it will show you the signal strength of that action. This can be really helpful to show you what signal strength input you're needing for a specific action. But then we have this design that uses the same redstone circuit as the ones we were looking at earlier, except that it uses a calibrated sensor instead of a regular one. And this one is basically those first two designs combined into one, where it cares about what action you're taking and where you're taking that action. So here we have the input set to 3, so it cares about using items, such as, launching a firework. And then we have this redstone circuit out at the end that cares about distance. So you have to not only use the correct action, but also use it in the correct place. And this is because there is a piece of redstone dust next to the sensor rather than a comparator. Remember that if there's dust next to the sensor, it cares about distance, whereas if there's a comparator next to the sensor, it cares about type. But we will only get a redstone output if we do the correct action in the correct place, such as on top of that wool block or diagonally from the sensor. Because also keep in mind, when it comes to distance, the sensors can't tell which direction a vibration came from unless you have wool around the sensor that is blocking those vibrations. So when you put a distance limitation on the sensors, think of it like a circle. Like there is a 1 block circle around the sensor that it is now looking for. And so if you want to further fine-tune where this circle is, you have to use wool to block parts of that circle. And I'll talk more about that in the examples at the end of the video. But when it comes to figuring out the signal strength for distance, it's definitely a little more complicated than figuring out the action. If you have a comparator coming out of the sensor, again, you just do the action and it shows you the signal strength for that action. Or like if we eat some food, it shows us that food has a signal strength of 8. So now we know that consuming items has a signal strength of 8. So you don't even necessarily have to look up the list, when it comes to doing actions. But when it comes to distance, basically it's just kind of trial and error, because there's no easy way to know the signal strength, in compared to distance. But if we wanted this to filter for food, we would simply turn that first book to where it's providing a signal strength of 8, and now the sensor will know whenever we're eating food, but will ignore us jumping and stuff like that. But for distance, it can be slightly awkward. So basically you just go to where you want the distance activation to be, and you do an action, and you try to remember the signal strength provided from that. The closer you are, the higher the signal strength will be. So if we activate something on this red block, such as eating food, we get a signal strength of 13. And so we need to set this book to 1 less than that signal strength. So we need to set this book to 12 if we want it to activate 1 block away from the sensor. But rather than figuring out the signal strength for the distance, you can actually build this circuit first, and then use the circuit to tell you the signal strength that you need. So if we do an action and the subtraction mode comparator does not turn on, then the book input is too strong. But if we do an action and the rightmost repeater turns on, then the book input is too weak. And so you can kind of just adjust until the center redstone activates without the rightmost repeater activating. And then that will, program it to that specific distance. And once you have it set, it won't activate if you're closer or farther away when taking an action. But now let me explain how the circuit actually works. It is super duper simple. So this comparator is receiving a signal strength from the book and lectern, and it is subtracting that number from the other comparator that's on subtraction mode. This comparator is receiving a signal strength from the sensor based on distance, and so when the signal from the sensor is stronger than the signal being subtracted by the book, it's trying to activate the centermost repeater that has a maximum delay. But if it's one too strong, then it will activate that rightmost repeater, which will lock the center repeater before it has a chance to activate. And the rightmost comparator is simply carrying the same signal strength that it's receiving, because the dust coming out of a comparator is the same signal strength as the strength going into a comparator. It's not until the second redstone dust coming off of a comparator that the signal will actually degrade. So if we change the left book to register the use of items, now we can actually kind of see what's going on. So if we activate an item too far away, then the leftmost comparator won't activate. But if we activate an item too close, the signal strength will be strong enough to activate that rightmost repeater, which will then lock the middle repeater and prevent it from activating. And that's why the middle repeater needs a delay, is so that it doesn't activate from strong signals before the rightmost repeater has a chance to lock it. And the circuit is exactly the same on all of the designs. Now, of course, you don't even need the distance circuit. You can just use a calibrated Sculk sensor to dictate type. And then the last feature we need to talk about is resonance. So if you have an amethyst block that is adjacent to or on top of a Sculk sensor of any kind, when it receives an activation, it will resonate to other sensors in the nearby area. And this only works with the comparator coming off of the sensor, because what is actually resonating is the type of action, not the distance. This doesn't work with the distance, it only works with the type of action. And then the amethyst block needs to be at least within the hearing distance of a sensor. So a regular sensor, again, has a radius of 8, so the amethyst block needs to be within 8 from the next sensor. Where with the calibrated sensor, it has a range of 16, so it only needs to be 16 blocks away from the amethyst block. So essentially what is happening is the amethyst block is mimicking whatever action is being taken. So if we use an item that has a signal strength of 3, and so then the next sensor will pick up the use of an item from the amethyst block. Now, one thing that's kind of weird is I would have assumed this works within simulation distance. But as we can see, simulation distance ends way over there, but the resonation is not carrying out to simulation distance. It's kind of stopping within 2 chunks from me, so that's like half of simulation distance. But a weird thing is if I start loading these, now it will all of a sudden carry the signal even past simulation distance. But you may have noticed that the signal wasn't correct, and that was because it registers the first signal that it receives, and that's what it carries. It ignores all other ones. So whatever action it records first and tries to send to, I guess, unloaded sections is the action that will be carried when those sections are loaded. So like if we jump, that's a signal strength of 2. And then if we consume an item, or use an item, that's a signal strength of 3. But now if we load these that are farther away, they will register the jumping one because that's what we did first. And so, it's very strange. Again, I would have just assumed that this works within simulation distance, but it seems to only work within half of simulation distance. And so I'm not really sure what the specific distance limitation is, but this is a way that you can wirelessly transmit the action being taken in a specific area and send that to a sensor that would normally be out of range. And now onto some build examples, starting with one that uses the resonance feature. So here we have a sensor that is flooded so that we won't be able to hear it activating because it will activate no matter what we do. And then the amethyst block next to it will be projecting to this calibrated sensor over here. We have a flooded cauldron, which has a signal strength of 3, so this calibrated sensor is looking for us using an item. It is also toggling a T-flop to open and close the door. So whenever it hears us using an item, it will toggle the T-flop, which will toggle the door. Now this sensor over here doesn't actually need an input to dictate what action it's looking for, because the one that it's broadcasting to will be actually filtering out the actions, looking for us just using an item. So anytime that we use an item over here, it will broadcast that information to the one that's actually looking for the use an item action. Now also, you'll be able to use an item anywhere around this, so we can just surround this completely with wool in order to force the item activation to be over where the other sensor is rather than near the door. So all of this wool will completely block it from registering vibrations from actions over here. So we can use items all we want to now, and it'll never be able to hear it because the wool is blocking it. But since there is a hollow tube going from this sensor to the other one, if we use an item over here, it will toggle the door by broadcasting the resonance from the amethyst block to the other sensor. And using wool is a really easy way to specify where you want the player to activate the sensor from. So like here, we have a tube with a regular sensor in the middle of it. Then we have a comparator looking at that sensor through the wool, and that is simply toggling the door. So now anytime the sensor hears something, it will open the door, but it will only be able to hear something in the block directly above it. So no matter what we do anywhere except for the block that is directly above it, the door will not toggle. But as soon as we step on or use an item on, the block that the sensor is actually sensing, the door will toggle. And of course, this doesn't have to be glass. It can be any block you want to, including the same blocks as the floor, to make it perfectly hidden. So this is also kind of like an invisible pressure plate. And of course, this doesn't have to be directly in front of the door. We can run this anywhere, and we can use something like a T-flop in order to keep the door open. So even if the trigger activation is really far away from the door, the T-flop will keep the door open. So now, whenever we do something directly above the sensor, the door will toggle between open and closed. And since we're using a T-flop, we can run additional inputs to that T-flop. That's one of the amazing things about a T-flop, is that you can have, multiple sensors or just like a button or a pressure plate to toggle it also. So, you can have the secret entrance somewhere on the outside and then simply have a button or a pressure plate on the inside to toggle the T-flop closed. And then we can combine wool with a calibrated sensor to dictate a specific area for a specific action. So here we have a calibrated sensor in there, and it is receiving a signal strength of 8 from this bookend lectern using the comparator to shove the power through the block. Then we have a comparator on the other side that is pulling the signal out and sending it up to the door. Now I will say, with a signal strength of 8, that is consuming items. But when consuming items, it doesn't seem to be as precise as some other actions, like using an item or movement or jumping, because if we're one block away from the hole and we eat an item, it will still activate for some reason. The only thing I can think of is that, either the eating is triggered a little higher because you're, eating it. So maybe since you're 2 blocks tall, it's actually coming from 2 blocks above the ground. This will still filter it into a small area, but it won't be a single tile. And we can see the difference if we switch this down to 3, which is use an item. If we use an item anywhere, it won't work unless we use it directly above the sensor. And so I'm not really sure why eating food is slightly less precise, but it is. So keep that in mind that, it'll still be a small area, but it won't be a single block. And you also may have noticed that the calibrated Sculk sensor sends a very, very short signal. That is definitely not enough time for us to make it through the door. A regular sensor does last long enough. It's more like a pressure plate. But a calibrated Sculk sensor is more like an observer. It sends like a single tick rather than a pulse. And so we either need a T-flop or an extender in order to increase the duration of activation so that we can actually make it through the door. So here we're just going to add an extender right here so that it will extend the duration of the redstone signal. It is just a simple comparator extender. So now whenever we activate the calibrated sensor, it should be long enough for us to actually make it through the door. And then of course, if you need it to activate even longer, you can simply add comparators to the comparator extender. And if you're not sure how comparator extenders work or how to make them, be sure to check out my Let's Learn Redstone video about shorteners and extenders. But if you don't have enough space under the floor to have a wool tube, or you just want to do it slightly differently, you can always use the redstone circuit to dictate the distance. This is the same circuit that we went over earlier, and it uses a calibrated Sculk sensor to dictate what type of action it's looking for. And so this book in lectern is set to a signal strength of 3, which means it's looking for us using an item, such as shooting a rocket. And then the distance has been set to be in the middle of the hallway next to the sensor. So anywhere on these blue blocks, it will activate. Now remember again, with distance, it will be a circle around the sensor. And so there's going to be multiple tiles that you can activate a rocket on in order to open the door. And so already there are two problems with this design. One, we have multiple tiles that will open and close the door, where maybe we only want it to activate from a single tile. And then two, the door doesn't actually stay open long enough because we're using a calibrated Sculk sensor. So we need to extend the duration of the door opening, and we need to limit the tiles that will actually open the door. So here we added an extender to extend the duration that the door will stay open, and then we, added some wool in order to block some of the tiles where you can't activate rockets just kind of anywhere. So with this, the blue wool will block any vibrations coming from anywhere except for on top of the light blue concrete. So if we shoot a rocket on top of the light blue concrete, the door will open. And then the extender will keep the door open long enough for us to actually go through. Now, I will say that when using wool to limit the space, sometimes you have to get a little creative, because we need the wool to actually be in the wall, so maybe use brown wool to blend it in like its texture. Because if we have, in this specific example, if we have the wool farther back, now you will be able to activate it from the brown blocks as well as the light blue block. Having the wool farther back will still block a bunch of the vibrations, but if you want a single block activation rather than 3 block activation, there's an easy way to tell what is being blocked by the wool. Simply draw a straight line from the center of the sensor, past the corner of the wool blocks that are blocking the vibrations. So here we see the center of the sensor actually makes it to the center of these brown blocks on the ground, which means that it will pick up a vibration from those blocks. Where if we move the wool 1 forward, now from the center of the sensor to the center of the brown blocks is blocked. So the sensor will no longer be able to detect vibrations from that area. So remember, just draw a straight line from the center of the sensor to the center of the blocks that you're trying to prevent from receiving vibrations, and then place wool accordingly. And this extender is being powered because this repeater is shoving strong power into this block, which will power redstone underneath that block. And then this book is set to a signal strength of 3 to dictate items being used. Then the other book in lectern is subtracting a signal strength from the subtraction comparator, assigning a minimum strength to turn on that comparator, and then if the comparator strength is too strong, the repeater will get locked by the leftmost repeater. And since the middle repeater has a delay, if it gets locked before it activates, then it will not toggle the door. And if any of this is confusing, you can either check out my other Let's Learn Redstone videos, or let me know in the comments and I will do my best to help. But here we have a simpler design that doesn't care about distance at all. It uses a lever to dictate the action it's looking for, and then a comparator extender to make sure the door stays open long enough. And since the lever is directly next to the calibrated sensor, it has a signal strength of 15, which means it will ignore every action except for mobs and players dying or an explosion like TNT. So with this door, if we kill a fish near the sensor, it will open the door. Or if you kill a zombie, or if you die, or if you light some TNT, anything that has a signal strength of 15 will trigger the door to open. So this is a really simple way to activate any sort of redstone contraption by using a specific action. Or here we have a cauldron full of water, which has a signal strength of 3, going into a calibrated sensor that has been flooded so that it's silent. And then we have a comparator pulling signal off of that, going into a T-flop to toggle the door. And so now, we have a secret hidden activation. Because it's a signal strength of 3, it cares when we use an item, such as shooting a rocket, anywhere in this area, since it doesn't care about distance. But since it's flooded, we won't even know it's there. So even if someone accidentally opens the door by shooting a rocket or something, they won't be able to hear how they did it. So maybe they won't know, and it'll make it a little bit more secret. And if you're wondering why all of these examples are doors, if you've watched my previous Let's Learn Redstone videos, I always use doors as examples just because they're very easy to understand. We all know that we're trying to open a door long enough for a player to get through. But you can just replace the door with piston doors or with machines or farms. The door is just an example of the machine you're trying to activate. Again, I only use doors because it's not complicated to understand. But that's all we got for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it made sense. Again, if you have any questions or requests, let me know in the comments and I will do my best to help you out. And if you haven't yet, be sure to check out my other full videos on Let's Learn Redstone, because I made this one with the assumption that you've seen the other videos, so that you know how extenders work, you know how to build a T-flop, you know about strong and weak power, etc, etc. So if any of it didn't make sense, that might be why. So definitely go check those out. And again, let me know if you have any questions. Again, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to like, favorite, share, and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and I can't keep doing this without your support. So a big shout out to all of my subscribers and all of my supporters. It is because of you that I can continue making these, so I really hope they help you out. And if you don't know what to say, just tell me hi. I would love to hear from you down in the comments. But until next time, I've been your host, OmLedu, hopefully teaching you a redstone trick or two, and reminding you, as always, don't forget to have fun. Bye-bye.